morning if that was the case. We're covering chapters 42 all the way through to chapter 45, and what you get here is two journeys to Egypt. We've been following Joseph throughout the story of his life, but here the scene cuts at chapter 42, and it cuts back to what is happening with Joseph's family remaining in the land of Canaan, and it is incredibly dramatic. What chapters 42 through 45 are talking about are two journeys to Egypt that his brothers make to buy grain. And in these two journeys, there's a series of meetings with their brother Joseph. And they don't know it's him, but he knows it's them. And he puts them to the test. There's a series of tests. There's even a series of setups and tricks. If you haven't read these sections of the story of Joseph's life, you have to read it. It's like a film. It's incredible. But when you read it, you're kind of left with the question. I was left with this question this week. What on earth is going on? That's a question that we've had throughout we've been reading the story of Joseph, and each week we can come away thinking, what on earth is going on? And the answer every week is a really simple answer. God is at work. That's what's going on. That's what's going on throughout the whole of Joseph's life and the whole of the story, and especially this section from chapters 42 through 45. God is at work. And actually, he says as much. Joseph says as much in chapter 45 and verse 5, if you have it in front of you. There's these two clauses. You sold me. God sent me. You sold me into Egypt. You sold me into slavery. But actually, underneath and through all of that, it was God who was sending me. God is at work, just like in every other part of the Joseph story. But what specifically is he doing here at this point? Now, if you think about Joseph's brothers, the people who had sold him into slavery, they have been keeping the secret of what they had done for years. They hadn't talked about it. They kept it from their father. Their father thinks that Joseph is dead when actually he's alive in Egypt. They've been keeping the secret. But the truth is, the secret had been keeping them. It was eating them alive from the inside out. See, the truth would set Joseph's brothers free, but they preferred to remain in the dark. They were keeping the secret, but the secret was keeping them. But thankfully, God is at work. And God has a way to bring these things to light. And he does that through one thing alone: discipline. God disciplines Joseph's brothers. And that's what this passage in Genesis is all about. God disciplines his children. God disciplines his chosen family. And there are three things that this passage shows us that we so desperately need to learn about God's discipline. Firstly, the meaning of discipline. What does discipline mean? What do we mean when we use that word? Secondly, the method of discipline. What are the things that God uses to discipline his children and bring them to greater spiritual maturity? And then finally, the means of discipline. Well, how can God actually do those things? The meaning of discipline, the method of discipline, and the means of discipline. So what does discipline mean? What does the Bible mean when it uses that word? Because actually the word discipline has a bad reputation right now. When we think of discipline, it almost always has a negative association. We associate it with punishment. We associate it with vengefulness. But the Bible, if you read it, is almost universally positive about the role of discipline in the life of God's children. The Bible defines discipline like this: fatherly, loving care for the well-being of your children. That's how the Bible defines discipline: fatherly, loving care for the well-being of your children. It's just part of good parenting. That's what discipline is. Whether it's earthly parenting or heavenly parenting, discipline is indispensable for the health and well-being of the child. But there's a contrast, isn't there? We've been looking at Joseph's family. Not exactly a poster family, is it? If you look back at what we've been seeing throughout these weeks, and if you look at the upbringing of Jacob's brothers, you realize that their family was hardwired to harm them, not help them. It was an awful family to be a part of. It was rife with favoritism, jealousy, hatred. There was eventually attempted murder, which ends in human trafficking. Not so disciplined. Not so disciplined at all. Even though he was one of God's chosen people, Jacob, the father of all these sons, was a lousy father. He was a bad father. He shirked his responsibility time after time after time. God had given him opportunities to do the right thing, but he seemed to delight in doing the wrong thing. Here's what he got wrong. He constantly got the boundaries wrong with his sons. I mean, think about how he treated Joseph. He doted on Joseph. He was far too lenient with him. He favored him over all of his other sons. But on the other hand, he was far too harsh and critical with the other 11. He was a failure. He was a failure of a father. Even when you read about him in the chapters of Genesis that we're considering this morning, he is incredibly self-pitying. He's incredibly self-obsessed. He relates every single trial back to himself, and he doesn't seem to care at all about what is happening to his family as it falls apart around his ears. He's a terrible father. And you can see that. I'm not just making this up, by the way. Look at how much trust has broken down in the family. During the famine, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy food, but he doesn't send Benjamin with them. Isn't that odd? He sends all of his sons to go and buy grain, but not Benjamin. Why is that? Why is he being so fussy? See, Benjamin was the second youngest son of his after Joseph. Benjamin was the second son of his beloved wife Rachel while she was still alive. Just read verse 4 of chapter 42. Jacob is afraid of what is going to happen to Benjamin if he sends him to Egypt with the rest of his sons, because Jacob trusts his other sons about as far as he can throw them. That's how far trust has broken down in his family. Jacob has already lost his beloved Joseph, and he can't bear to risk Benjamin as well. Jacob didn't know for sure what had happened to Joseph, but he had his suspicions. He had no doubt about the guilt of his sons, even though he couldn't prove what they'd done. Isn't that a messed up family? Can you see how broken that is? Can you see the deep need for help and change? An emergency procedure is needed if this family is going to stop itself from falling apart. So what is God doing in these chapters? See, by confronting the brothers and by pursuing them through Joseph, God was being the father that these boys never had. God was being the father that these sons had never had. God was not going to drop the ball. He was going to discipline these boys, these men, for their good. The Bible has a lot to say about the subject of discipline. You might have heard of the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs was written as a father's instruction and a mother's instruction to their son. It is a book of parental wisdom and discipline. And here's what it has to say about discipline. Proverbs 13, verse 24. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. See that? Discipline flows from love. Or Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord disciplines those whom he loves. As a father, the son in whom he delights. So I don't know what kind of family you grew up in. Maybe the discipline was far too harsh. Maybe it left marks on you, physical and psychological. Maybe you were part of a family where discipline was far too lenient. Maybe even today you're a parent who is struggling to apply discipline consistently and fairly. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong. But we're reminded here that discipline is not punishment. Discipline is not punishment. That's crucial. The very best discipline flows from a parent's love and delight in the child. Not vengeance, not vindictiveness. And you can see that God isn't punishing Jacob's sons because they don't get what they deserve. They sold their brother into slavery. They tried to murder him. What do they deserve? They deserve death. Punishment back in that time was eye for an eye, and the sentence was clear. And put yourself in Joseph's position. Wouldn't Joseph be entirely justified if he did seek justice, if he did try to punish them for what they'd done? If you read these chapters at first glance, it looks like that's exactly what Joseph is doing. Remember when Jim was reading it, it said that Joseph treated his brothers harshly, as if they were strangers. Nothing would be more natural. But if you read on, you'll realize that his compassion is operative underneath his harshness. His compassion grows warm and tender. He weeps at times for his brothers. See, he loves them still. Joseph, and God through Joseph, doesn't want retribution. He wants restoration. That's the meaning of discipline, not punishment, but sometimes heavy-handed treatment to bring restoration and healing. See, God is disciplining these brothers so that they're going to be freed from the folly that is bound up in their hearts because of their sin. God doesn't want the brothers to be destroyed to satisfy his anger. He wants them to be saved to satisfy his love. You have to know that about discipline. You have to know that. Through disciplining these brothers, God is enacting a kind of loving fatherly care and love for them that they so desperately needed but lacked from their own father. Jacob didn't step up, so God stepped in. That's what's happening in these passages. And God stepped in with tough love. But it was tough love that they needed. And that leads us to our second point, the method of God's discipline. You know, we've seen the fact that God disciplines us, haven't we? But how does he do it? And this section of Genesis is an absolute masterclass. Tough love. God disciplines us with tough love. And in these chapters of Genesis, Joseph gives his brothers a series of tests. He puts them in situations that force them to make tough decisions to see what they're going to choose. And now the Hebrew word for test that is used in these passages is actually a term from metallurgy. It's a term that was used for when metal was heated up to smelt it. And when metal was melted, its purity was determined, because when you melt metal, the impurities rise to the surface so that you can see them and then skim them off so that the metal will be purer at the end of the process. Can you see that's exactly what is happening here? Joseph, through the tests that he's administering, is turning up the heat on his brothers, and he's kind of holding their feet to the fire so that their flaws will come to the surface so that they can be removed. And there was a commentator I read this week that put it incredibly. He says this: behind Joseph's harsh pose, there was warm affection. And after the ordeal, overwhelming kindness. Even the threats were tempered with mercy. And the shocks that were administered took the form of embarrassments rather than blows. A vindictive Joseph could have dismayed his brothers with worthless sackloads of grain, or tantalized them at his feast as they had tantalized him. His enigmatic gifts were a kinder and more searching test. Just how well judged was his policy can be seen in the growth of quite new attitudes in the brothers, as the alternating sun and frost broke them open to God. That is a perfect description of what's happening here. The alternating sun and frost, heat and cold, smelting, melting, and solidifying, that is bringing out the impurities in Joseph's brothers, at times hard, at times tender, but always loving. Joseph is doing this to his brothers to break the ice over their hearts. He's trying to save them from their guilt. He's trying to awaken their consciences. Joseph, and God through Joseph, is wounding his brothers so that he can heal them. There's a kind of surgical severity to what he's doing. And the tools that God is using is truth. Truth given in love. The truth will set these brothers free. So God goes after it like a surgeon. He wants to expose their guilt, not to shame them, but to save them. And if you turn to chapter 42, verse 21, there's a crucial moment. There's a crucial moment in this story where the brothers start to suspect that something is happening to them. Here's what it says. Then they said to one another, In truth, we're guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us." And Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." Did you hear that? In truth, we are guilty. This is the first time in the entire story of Joseph where his brothers have finally admitted their guilt. They finally give expression to it after all these years that they have been keeping their secrets. They think what is happening to them is a reckoning. They think it's punishment, it's payback, but it's not. It's actually an emergency medical procedure to get the illness and the sickness out. Listen, sometimes in discipline, guilt is to the soul what pain is to the body. Do you realize that we need pain to show us when things are wrong so that we will go and seek help? Listen, God, as he disciplines us, uses guilt, not to shame us, but to call us to seek him so that we might be unburdened of our guilt and be healed. It shows us when we're feeling those things that something is wrong and needs treatment to be set right. And the best way to describe this is from C.S. Lewis. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's part of the Chronicles of Narnia. My grandfather used to read it to my sister and I when we were children and staying with them up in the Midlands. And I'll always remember the story in that book of a boy named Eustace Scrubb. And Eustace Scrubb is a little boy who gets into a lot of trouble. And he's in the land of Narnia, and he comes across a huge pile of treasure. And like any young boy, he starts to fantasize about what he could do with all that money, all the sweets he could buy, all the power he could get, all the things that he could do, all the places that he could go. And as he's thinking about this, he starts to fall asleep. And he falls asleep on this pile of gold, this pile of treasure. And when he wakes up, he discovers he's been turned into a scaly dragon. Why? Well, he's gone to sleep on this pile of gold thinking greedy, dragonish thoughts. And those thoughts have transformed him into this scaly monster. And he wakes up, sees his reflection in a mirror, and is so frightened that he tries to tear his scales off. But no matter how hard he tries, he can't do it. He's stuck like this dragon forever. And he despairs. But then along comes Aslan, the lion. Now, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan is the Christ figure. And Aslan comes along and he tells Eustace to follow him. And he takes Eustace to a well that if he'll get into it is going to heal him. But the problem is the well is too small for a dragon to get into. So he needs help. And here's what happens. Then Aslan said, "But I don't know if he spoke. You'll have to let me undress you." I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now. So I just lay down flat on my back to let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done it myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt. And there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly, looking than the others had been. And there was I, smooth and soft as a peeled switch and smaller than I had been. See, to save Eustace from being the dragon and to cleanse him from his sin, Aslan has to cut him deep. And it's only the claws of the lion that are going to turn Eustace into a human again. And in the same way, God's discipline of the brothers cuts them deep. It cuts them to the very heart. But do you see what he's doing? He's pulling the scales off. He's saving them from themselves so that they can become human again. Their sin had dehumanized them, and they needed to be saved from it through extreme measures. That's the method of discipline. That is what God will employ in every one of our lives to save us from the things that will eventually destroy us, like any good father, like any good parent. That's the method of discipline. But how? how can God do what he does without punishing people? Because we need to turn to the last thing that we're taught in these chapters, and that's finally the means of discipline, because the whole story comes to a climax in chapter 44. Joseph, after all the tests that he's given his brothers, sets up a final test. And on their second journey from Egypt back to Canaan with food, a silver cup is planted in Benjamin's luggage, the beloved Benjamin, which would make him look like a thief. And then it's discovered. So the brothers come cringing back to Joseph in Egypt, and they're so afraid of what he's going to do to them. But what Joseph is doing here is amazing. And I want you to realize this. Joseph has set the brothers up in exactly the same situation that they had put him in years and years ago. They had an opportunity to sell Joseph into slavery. And now Joseph is giving them an opportunity to sell Benjamin into slavery as well. One little betrayal of their youngest brother, and he was only a half-brother at that, and they save their own skin. They walk scot-free, as the saying goes. Joseph has set them up in the same situation to see if they will fail or do the right thing this time. See, the tension is immense. Has the discipline worked? Have the scales been removed? Have they become human again? And then something incredible happens in verses 32 to 34, something completely unexpected. Judah steps up. Judah, the ringleader of the original betrayal of Joseph, the man who has failed time and time again to take responsibility for anything, steps up. And what he says is incredible. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy Benjamin to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. My friends, if you know anything about Judah, that is astounding. Do you know what he's doing there? Instead of sacrificing Benjamin for his own self-interest, Judah is sacrificing himself for the interest of his brothers. He offers to bear the blame instead and to be Benjamin's substitute. And immediately after Judah says that, Joseph's heart is melted and he reveals who he is to his brother. He says, I'm Joseph. Don't worry. I'm okay. You couldn't write this because the discipline had done its work. The brothers' hearts had been melted. The door is wide open to reconciliation and forgiveness. It's a beautiful story, isn't it? Through all the years of pain and heartache and hurt and discipline, there is healing. There is hope. There is love. There is reconciliation. It's a beautiful story. But there's a nagging problem. The brothers deserve punishment for what they've done. Who gets the punishment? Remember, the Bible teaches God's discipline of his people flows from his love and delight in them. How can God delight in Judah and the rest of his crooked brothers? How can God discipline them and not punish them or not punish us for the wrongs that we have done? Who bears the blame? Do you see? Judah, with all his flaws, is foreshadowing his most famous descendant, Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Aslan himself, the one whose claws cut so deep in order to save us. One day a man will be born in the line of Judah that will become the ultimate substitute for his crooked brothers, who would sell him into slavery, who would sell him into the hands of the Romans, who would sell him to the cross itself. Jesus, the Lion of Judah, who never did any wrong, received the punishment that you and I deserve, so that instead we can receive the fatherly, loving correction of God. See, in this story, Judah merely offered his life. Jesus actually died. He actually gave up his life. He lost his life. He bore the punishment and the blame for our sin before the Father. And because the punishment for our sin has already fallen on Jesus, you can know that whatever trials and suffering you're going through in your life, it is not punishment. It is loving correction that is eventually going to lead you to being more like Jesus. There's no punishment left for us to face. Only the Father's loving discipline. What a beautiful story that we have in the gospel. And as I leave you here this morning, I just want to make this concrete for us. What does this mean for us here? There's so many things, but I'm only going to choose one or two. The first thing that it means is that it's so tempting when we're suffering or experiencing God's discipline to feel like we're being punished. Don't we feel like that? We ask, what have I done? What have I done to deserve this? This whole passage shows how false that premise is. How can we say that we're being punished when we are just being tested or disciplined by God? The punishment's already fallen on Jesus. How could he be punishing us? Believer, friend, here this morning, I don't know what you're going through, but I can tell you with confidence that it is not God punishing you. Don't lay that on him. He is not punishing you. God is the perfect heavenly Father. He knows exactly what discipline you need and exactly how long you need it for. Shall we not be subject to the Father of spirits and live? Life is his aim. That's the first thing. God is not punishing you. The second thing, if you believe in Jesus, the greatest assaults on you and your happiness can only fulfill God's plan for you. That is the story of the whole of Joseph's life. Joseph says as much in chapter 45, verse 5. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Isn't that incredible? He's saying, guys, don't beat yourself up. Even though you sold me into slavery, God brought me here to preserve life. That's incredible. Remember, God meant it for good. The things that look like obstacles to your faith and growth are, in the hands of your heavenly Father, the vehicles to your faith and growth. That's how amazing he is. There's nothing in this world that can lay you so low that God will not use to lift you high. And that is true. Finally, and this has really struck me this week, when God disciplines you, he's after something. He's after your idols. Every single one of us is putting our trust in things for our worth and significance and hope that are not God. Things that if you continue to trust in them more than God will lead you to misery and destruction. Idols will make you radically insecure, radically unstable, radically fragile, radically self-obsessed, and God is going to come and put his finger on them to make them teeter so that you will shift your trust to him. There was an illustration I heard about this that I think is the best way of putting it, so I want to share it with you this morning. One of the things I love doing is going back to Montana with my wife, because in Montana, there are trees everywhere. And they are thick. The place is thick with pine trees. But companies come along and they clear cut all the trees. But back in the day, you used to need lumberjacks because there were no chainsaws. You just had to have a man with an axe to chop all of the trees down. And there was a story that was told about a lumberjack that comes to a grove of trees. And his job is to cut them all down at the end of the week. And as he comes to survey the trees, he looks up. And in one of the trees, he sees a nest. And there's a bird that has made its nest in one of the trees that is about to come down. So he thinks fast. He takes the flat of his axe and he smacks the tree with his axe as much as he can, and he shakes the nest so that the bird will take flight and go into the next tree. But that tree's coming down as well. So he goes to that tree and he smacks that tree with his axe until the bird flies to the next tree as well. And then on and on and on and on until eventually the bird gets the message. And it flies to a high rock and it makes its nest in the rock. So the lumberjack goes home and the bird looks down and goes, "What was wrong with that guy? Why is he making life so hard for me? I was happy in that tree, but now I've had to make my nest in this rock." But don't you see? Every single tree in that grove was coming down. If the bird had stayed in that tree, it would have been destroyed along with its whole family. My friends, every tree in this life is coming down. I don't know what tree you are nesting in this morning, but God is going to come along and he is going to smack that tree as hard as he can, and he is going to shake you as often as he needs to so that you will learn to make your nest in the rock. And so that, like Joseph's brothers, you will learn to trust in God alone. You have to build your nest in the rock, and your tree is going to be shaken until he does that. Have you made your nest in the rock yet? If you're not a believer here this morning, come and make your nest in the rock. And believer, if you are here this morning and you are straying, come and make your nest in the rock. Don't be covered by your secrets. Uncover them before God. If you're feeling guilt this morning, come and bring it to him so that you might be unburdened and free and fly like a bird to the mountain. There is grace enough in Jesus for everything that you have done and every wound and every sin. If you come here this morning feeling like a scaly dragon, Jesus is going to rip those scales off, and it will be painful, but you will become whole again because God disciplines us, but he disciplines those whom he loves. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much that you are the Father that we need. Thank you that you are the Father that never leaves us, never forsakes us, never shirks his duty. And as we come to the table this morning, oh Lord, help us to remember that you were the substitute. You took the punishment, you took the blame, you bore the wrath so that we can receive only the wounds of grace. Thank you. We come to you this morning in praise and humility and awe, lost in wonder, love, and praise. Amen.